My sister's teenage son grabbed my graduation cake, slammed it onto the floor, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Get on your knees and eat it." The room exploded with laughter. Not one person stopped him. Not my sister, not my parents, not even the relatives who had spent the last hour congratulating me. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misunderstood what was happening. It didn't make sense. A minute earlier, everyone had been smiling, taking pictures, and talking about how proud they were that I'd finally graduated. Then, in one unbelievably cruel moment, everything changed. The cake lay upside down across the hardwood floor, frosting smeared in every direction. My nephew kept staring at me. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't nervous. He looked entertained, like he was waiting for the punchline. "Well?" he said, folding his arms. "Go ahead." More laughter rippled through the room. Someone actually muttered, "This is priceless." I looked around, expecting at least one adult to step in. Instead, I saw people avoiding my eyes. Some looked uncomfortable, others smiled awkwardly. A few were openly laughing. The silence from the people who should have defended me hurt even more than the words coming from a teenager. I finally looked at my sister. She was standing only a few feet away. She watched her son without saying a word. Then she shrugged. "Oh, relax," she said. "He's just kidding." Just kidding. I looked back at the cake on the floor. Hours of planning. The celebration everyone insisted we have. The congratulations. The photos. And suddenly, I was the joke. "I don't think that's funny," I said quietly. My nephew rolled his eyes dramatically. "See?" He laughed. "She always has to ruin everything." A couple of relatives chuckled again. One of my cousins actually whispered, "She's so sensitive." Sensitive? That word followed me for years. Whenever someone crossed a line. Whenever someone embarrassed me. Whenever someone insulted me. If I reacted at all, somehow I became the problem. I bent down. Not because I was going to do what he demanded, but because I wanted to salvage what was left of the cake. My nephew stepped forward and nudged the cardboard base with his shoe, pushing it even farther across the floor. "There," he said. "Now it's really ruined." I froze. That wasn't childish behavior anymore. That was deliberate. I looked at my parents. My dad sighed. My mom rubbed her forehead. Neither of them told him to stop. Instead, my mother quietly said, "Let's not make a bigger scene." A bigger scene. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't cried. I hadn't even raised my voice. Yet somehow I was already being warned not to overreact. I slowly stood back up. My hands were shaking. Not because of the cake. Because I suddenly realized something that had been building for years. This wasn't an isolated moment. This wasn't a teenager having one bad day. Everyone in that room had already decided whose feelings mattered. And mine weren't on the list. My sister walked over to her son and lightly patted his shoulder. "You should apologize," she said. For one brief second, I felt relieved. Then she smiled at him. "If it'll make your aunt happy." He smirked. "Sorry your cake couldn't survive gravity." More laughter. He didn't even look at me while saying it. He looked at his friends, like he wanted their approval. They laughed too. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I remembered birthdays where he'd screamed at relatives until they bought him more presents. Family dinners where he'd insulted servers while adults called him spirited. Holiday gatherings where he'd broken decorations, and somehow someone else always ended up apologizing. Every time someone tried correcting him, my sister defended him. "He's just expressing himself. He's just energetic. He's still growing." No, he had learned something much worse. He had learned that there were no consequences, because every adult around him removed them before they ever arrived. I quietly grabbed a roll of paper towels from the kitchen. No one helped. People simply stepped around the mess, while continuing conversations that had nothing to do with what had just happened. As I knelt to clean frosting off the floor, I heard another laugh behind me. I guess she's finally getting on her knees after all." It came from across the room. I didn't even look to see who had said it. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My vision blurred. Not from anger anymore. From disappointment. I kept thinking, if this had happened to anyone else here, would everyone still be laughing? Or was it only funny because it happened to me? That question stayed with me long after the floor was clean. Because, deep down, I already knew the answer. When I finally threw the ruined cake into the trash, nobody offered to replace it. Nobody apologized. Nobody even acknowledged what had happened. Within minutes, the party simply continued. Music came back on. People refilled their drinks. Kids ran through the house laughing. It was as if my humiliation had become nothing more than a brief interruption in everyone's evening. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching them, watching my nephew joke with relatives who had witnessed everything, watching my sister smile proudly at him, watching my parents pretend nothing unusual had happened. And for the first time that day, I stopped wondering why nobody defended me. Instead, I started wondering how many years I'd been convincing myself that this family would eventually change. That thought scared me far more than the ruined celebration, because once it entered my mind, I couldn't make it leave. I quietly picked up my keys. No announcement, no dramatic speech. I simply headed toward the front door. Behind me, someone finally noticed. "You're leaving already?" I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Before I answered, I realized something else. Nobody was asking because they were worried about me. They were asking because my leaving might make the atmosphere awkward. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to spend another minute pretending everything was normal. The front door opened, before anyone answered my question for them. Cool evening air hit my face, and for the first time all day, I could breathe. I heard footsteps behind me. Seriously. My sister called. "You're going to leave over a joke?" I turned around. The living room had gone quieter than it had been all afternoon. People weren't paying attention because they cared about me. They were paying attention because they wanted to see whether I would make a scene. "I hope you all have a good night," I said calmly. I stepped outside. My sister laughed once, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There she goes. Always so dramatic." A few people chuckled again. I closed the door without responding. The moment I got into my car, the silence hit me harder than anything that had happened inside. I rested both hands on the steering wheel and just sat there. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was exhausted. Not because of one ruined graduation party. Because I suddenly realized I had spent years trying to earn kindness from people who expected it from me, but never returned it. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. "I think you should apologize." I stared at the message for several seconds. Apologize? I called her. What exactly am I apologizing for? She sighed before answering. "You embarrassed everyone by leaving." "I embarrassed everyone?" "You know how your sister is. You could have handled it differently." I cleaned cake off the floor while everyone laughed at me. I know it wasn't ideal. "Mom? Your grandson told me to get on my knees and eat cake off the floor. He didn't mean it." "Then why didn't anyone stop him?" Silence. Finally she said quietly, "He's still young." I couldn't help laughing. Not because anything was funny, because I'd heard that excuse so many times I could practically finish the sentence for her. "Mom, being young explains mistakes. It doesn't excuse cruelty." She didn't answer. Instead she said, "I just want this family to move on." So do I. We ended the call without resolving anything. Over the next few days, nobody from my family apologized. Instead, I started hearing different versions of the story from relatives. Apparently, I had stormed out. Apparently, I had overreacted. Apparently, my nephew had only been playing around. Apparently, everyone was uncomfortable because I couldn't take a joke. It amazed me how quickly people rewrote events when admitting the truth would force them to confront their own behavior. One cousin even texted me. "I wasn't laughing at you." "I watched the video," I replied. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then one final message arrived. I didn't realize how bad it looked. Neither had I, not until I watched it. Someone had uploaded a short clip from the party into the family group chat. Maybe they thought it was funny. Maybe they hadn't watched the whole thing. I don't know. But there it was. The moment my nephew shoved the cake. The laughter. My sister smiling. Me standing completely still. Then quietly kneeling to clean the floor. Watching it from outside my own perspective made my stomach turn. I looked defeated, not angry, not dramatic. Just hurt. That hurt more than I expected. Because I realized everyone else had seen that exact same expression in real time. And still, nobody stepped in. 2 days later, my aunt called. "I owe you an apology." I hadn't expected that. She sounded embarrassed. I laughed, she admitted. Not because it was funny. Everyone else started laughing and I followed. After I watched that video again, I felt ashamed. I thanked her. It wasn't a magical fix, but it mattered. Someone had finally taken responsibility for their own actions, instead of explaining mine. Then she said something that stayed with me. "You know, this didn't start with the cake." "No. It started years ago." She was right. The cake wasn't the story. It was the clearest example of a pattern that had existed for as long as I could remember. Every family gathering had one predictable rule. Keep my sister happy. If that meant ignoring everyone else, so be it. About a week later, my dad asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no. Instead, I agreed. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, he sighed. I should have stopped him. Yes. I know. You should have. I kept thinking your sister would step in. But she didn't. I know. And then I kept waiting for you. He lowered his eyes. I failed. It was the first completely honest sentence anyone in my immediate family had said since the party. I don't know when we became like this, he admitted. I do. He looked at me. It happened every time nobody said anything. He nodded slowly. I think you're right. He apologized. A real apology. No excuses. No. If you were offended. No blaming stress. Just accountability. I accepted it. Forgiveness didn't erase what happened, but accountability gave us somewhere to start. My sister, unfortunately, went the opposite direction. She doubled down. According to her, I was trying to turn everyone against her son. She posted vague comments online about family members who play the victim. She never used my name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. I ignored every post. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in defending myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. A month passed. Then something unexpected happened. My nephew got suspended from school. Apparently he had humiliated another student during lunch. He thought it was hilarious. The school didn't. My sister called me that evening. This is different. Is it? He was just joking. So he said. He didn't deserve suspension. I imagine the other student didn't deserve humiliation either. She was quiet. Then she said, "You're comparing those things? I'm saying this wasn't random." She became defensive immediately. So now this is somehow my fault? No. It's everyone's fault who kept teaching him there would never be consequences. She hung up. Several relatives eventually reached out privately, not because of me, because they had begun experiencing the same behavior themselves. He mocked younger cousins, insulted older relatives, broke things in people's homes, expected everyone to laugh. Suddenly, the behavior wasn't funny anymore. Not because it had changed, because the target had. That realization was difficult to ignore. Months later, another family gathering was planned. I almost declined. Then I thought about something my aunt had said. If you stop showing up because of someone else's behavior, eventually, they'll think they own every room. So I went. Not to prove anything. Just to prove I didn't have to disappear. The atmosphere felt different the moment I walked in. People greeted me more carefully. Several apologized again. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable. My sister barely acknowledged me. My nephew avoided eye contact completely. For most of the evening, nothing happened. Then dessert was served. Someone jokingly asked, "Who wants to cut the cake?" The room went completely silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody smiled. Everyone remembered. My nephew looked around nervously. For the first time, he seemed to realize other people hadn't forgotten either. He quietly excused himself and walked outside. About 20 minutes later, I found him sitting alone on the back steps. I almost kept walking. Instead, I sat down a few feet away. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally he said, "I got suspended because of what happened at your party." "No." He frowned. "I got suspended because I embarrassed somebody." "Yes." Silence again. I didn't think it was a big deal. I know. I thought everyone was laughing. They were. So why was it wrong? Because laughter isn't always approval. Sometimes, it's cowardice. Sometimes people laugh because they're uncomfortable. Sometimes they laugh because they're afraid of standing alone. And sometimes, they're simply wrong. I didn't say all of that. Instead, I asked, "How did you feel when the principal described what happened at school?" He stared at the ground. "Pretty bad." Imagine feeling that way, while the people who were supposed to protect you laughed instead. His shoulders dropped. I didn't think about it like that. I know. He looked at me for the first time. "I'm sorry." It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't forced by his mother. It was quiet, awkward, real. "I believe you," I said. "And I'm still ashamed." "You should remember the feeling." He nodded. "So, you never make someone else feel it again." My sister wasn't happy when she learned we'd talked. She insisted I was manipulating her son. He interrupted her. "No, Mom." She stopped. "I was wrong." She stared at him in disbelief. "You don't have to apologize." "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." That was the first crack I'd ever seen in the story she'd built around him. Not because I confronted her. Because he finally started seeing himself honestly. Things didn't magically become perfect after that. Families rarely work that way. Trust takes far longer to rebuild than it does to destroy. Some relationships stayed distant. Some conversations remained uncomfortable. Some holidays were quieter than they used to be. But they were also more honest. People started speaking up. Jokes stopped crossing into humiliation. Someone would actually say, "That's enough." Those two words had been missing from our family for years. Every now and then, people ask me whether the ruined graduation party was the worst day of my life. It wasn't. It was the day I finally stopped pretending everything was okay. There's a difference. Losing the cake didn't matter. Losing the illusion did. For years I believed that if I stayed patient, stayed kind, stayed quiet, eventually people would notice how I was being treated. What I learned instead was that silence protects the loudest person in the room. Speaking honestly doesn't always fix a family. Sometimes it reveals the family you actually have. And painful as that realization was, it also gave me something I'd never had before. The freedom to stop chasing approval from people who only offered it when it was convenient. I still remember looking at that cake on the floor. At the time, I thought it represented the end of a celebration. Looking back now, I see it differently. That shattered cake marked the moment I stopped cleaning up messes I didn't create. And that turned out to be the most important graduation lesson I ever learned.